All right. And Miss Janie, did you want to make any introductions before we get started?
No, just to say how excited I am about this opportunity to hear from Dr. Eccleston. And on behalf of SECAC, we welcome all of our parents.
Thank you. And as Janie said, this is our usual SECAC time on the fourth Thursday of the month. We're a little early because of spring break this time, but we are excited to kick off our 13th annual Parent Empowerment Conference. On with me from the Family Support Center, I have Dr. Beth Hare, who is our instructional specialist, and Yvette Young, who is our social worker in our Family Support Center. My name is Marcy Torshin, and I'm also in the Family Support Center. And tonight we are excited to welcome Dr. Kristen Eccleston, and she brings a wealth of expertise and real-world experience to the field of special education, highlighted by her advanced degree from Johns Hopkins University, including a doctorate of education in mind, brain, and teaching, and a Master of Science in Special Education. She has over 15 years as a special education teacher and she is the innovator behind Montgomery County Public Schools ESESES program. Her career is marked by a deep commitment to supporting neurodiverse students. And as the director of social emotional services at Weinfeld Education Group and an adjunct professor at Towson, Dr. Eccleston continues to influence both the practical and academic sides of special education. Her research into adolescent mental health and previous participation in the Smithsonian Zero Barriers and STEM Education Advisory Committee underscores her dedication to enhancing educational outcomes for all students. She is a former National Board Certified Teacher in Exceptional Needs, and she is skilled at developing individual education plans or IEPs, conducting educational assessments, and crafting personalized learning strategies. Outside of her professional endeavors, Dr. Eccleston is a devoted mother to 2 elementary-age children, one of whom we heard playing the piano earlier as he was practicing, balancing her professional achievements and a rich family life. So Dr. Eccleston, I'm going to stop sharing and turn it over to you, and that way you can share your screen. And welcome. We're so excited that you're here.
Well, thank you. That was a lovely introduction. I really appreciate that. Thank you. Let me go ahead and get my screen started here, and we'll jump right in. All right. Hopefully everyone can see my screen. And again, thank you so much for having me, everyone, this evening. I truly appreciate it. I am going to try and touch on what I like to call the greatest hits of what is going on in education right now. As a director of social emotional services for Weinfeld Education Group, I see a lot of different things that are going on in the special education field, especially since post-COVID. I always hate bringing that up. I feel like, aren't we over that by now? But there really has been a lot of shifts since then. So kind of bringing up a lot of different topics. I'm hoping to make this as interactive as possible. I know there's nothing worse than a parent getting into something and feeling like I didn't get my questions answered. I didn't get, what I was hoping to get out of this. So I'm going to pause periodically throughout the presentation and open it up to question and answers on the different subjects or topics I'm talking about. And then at the end, whatever time is left over, just open it up to any general questions you have. I really like being a resource for parents, since I realize that sometimes when you're trying to navigate, especially the special education world, it has its own language. It has its own jargon. Sometimes it feels like people are speaking in different languages when you're in meetings. So I want to make sure that you have the opportunity to walk away this evening with any questions that you might have answered. So other than that, I'm going to go ahead and jump right into things. So again, tonight's presentation is really trying to focus on that theme of transition, but using transition in a more kind of global way. I'm going to be talking about transition, like true transition from high school into college. That's going to be in here, but I'm also going to talk about transitions from elementary school to middle school to high school, to transitions to getting a 504, to getting an IEP. So it's all centered around that theme of transition, and hopefully that will hit on almost any topic or area that you might have questions or concerns over. So my big takeaways, hopefully by the end of this evening for you, is that you have a better idea of collaborative support systems, personalized education strategies, empowerment through advocacy, and interactive engagements, hopefully that will give you some tailored insights and leave you understanding a little bit more about special education by the end of this evening. So I want to start off, and you can use the chat feature. That's probably the easiest way to do it, but just getting an idea of gauging what you're hoping to take away the most from tonight's session. Are you hoping to know more about transition? Do you want to hear more about mental health or school avoidance, working with an advocate, or just being able to ask general questions? And that way, I know if I should linger on a certain topic or if I should kind of move quickly through a topic. Again, I really want this to be a presentation that you find valuable. So having a better understanding from everyone who's participating about what you're hoping to take away will kind of help me this evening. And again, if you just want to plug into the chat feature, just real quick, some of the things that you're hoping to get more information about, I'll make sure that I highlight that this evening. All right, more about transition, advocacy, mental health. So it sounds like what I'm seeing, I should make sure I focus on all of these things this evening kind of equally. So I will make sure that I do that. Thank you for everyone who posted in the chat. All right, so I'm going to start with this essence of neurodiversity. One of the biggest questions I get is, what is neurodiversity? What does that mean? What does it mean to be neurodivergent? And I sometimes forget, because this is the world that I have lived in for almost 20 years, that sometimes what is common knowledge to me is not common knowledge to everyone. And so I always like to make sure that I pause and have a general understanding, or that everyone I'm speaking to has a general understanding. So I'm going to start with neurodiversity and kind of define that loosely for you. And neurodiversity is really, if you think of the concept of biodiversity, you know, what your environment, everything that's going on, neurodiversity is the same thing. Neurodiversity represents everybody's type of brain. If it's neurotypical, if it's neurodivergent, neurodiversity is really just the brain, and, you know, what could be normal, what could be a deficit. It includes everybody. But then when you switch that word from neurodiversity to neurodivergent, that's when you start to get that spectrum of autism, ADHD, dyslexia, sensory processing disorder, auditory processing disorder. I'm even going to show you a family tree in the next slide that I created that kind of shows how everything is kind of interconnected. But neurodivergent is really that all-encompassing umbrella term that covers anybody who has a brain that thinks differently. And I say differently because when I think of a neurotypical brain and I think of a neurodivergent brain, and if you could put them on a scale, they would weigh the exact same. One is not better than the other. One has its own challenges, the other has challenges, but it's just how we perceive the world and take in the information around us. So I don't see as one being better or one being a deficit over the other. It's just different. And one thing I will share, and you might even tell by the rate of how I talk, is I am neurodivergent. I am ADHD. I'm always very happy to tell people that I'm ADHD. And I always give the caveat that I'm professionally diagnosed, not TikTok diagnosed ADHD, since that seems to be an ongoing trend. But it's something that I'm proud of, because I was somebody who struggled when I was in school, and somebody who would have never thought I could have accomplished some of the things that I have in my lifetime, because I was not a great high school student. And I didn't know until I was 30 years old that I had ADHD. And then it was like my life just made a lot more sense. And that was partially what drove me into education as well, was because I wanted other students to understand that just because their brain learned differently didn't mean that there was anything wrong with their brain or that they weren't capable. Oftentimes, school can be a one-size-fits-all learning approach, and students who do see the world differently sometimes feel left out or that something's wrong with them. And I'll touch on that a lot this evening, because I'm hoping that we can start to shift that mindset, especially for our students, because there's nothing worse than feeling like something is wrong with you as a learner when it's not you as a learner, it's just how you need to learn and process information. And that kind of goes into those strengths and challenges too. We're all unique, every single one of us, regardless if you're neurotypical, if you're neurodivergent. We all bring something different to the table. We all have different strengths that we bring to the table. I think oftentimes when we look at people who are neurodivergent, we focus on a lot of those deficits, the executive functioning needs. We focus on, being disorganized, not being able to be on time to things, being forgetful. But we also forget that those are very creative brains. Those are brains that think outside the box. Those are brains that bring new perspectives. Those are the brains that have the ability to have high levels of intelligence and change the world. But if we constantly make children feel like something's wrong with them as a learner, then they miss those opportunities. So it's really important for us to emphasize that just because your brain processes information differently, that doesn't mean that there's anything wrong with you as a learner. It just means that you process information differently. And that's that importance of inclusion within the classroom setting, the value of creating inclusive environments that celebrate and support individuals who are neurodivergent. My daughter has a 504. She has ADHD as well. And I talk to her on a regular basis about what that means for her brain in school, what that means in terms of her learning and her understanding, because it's really important that she realize that although she might have to work a little bit harder in different areas in school than maybe her peers are having to, but again, it's not that there's anything wrong with her brain or how she learns. She just learns in a unique and a different type of way. And that's where when we get into IEPs and 504s, we can talk about some of those accommodations and those things that are needed for our kiddos who have those different ways of thinking. But it's important that we make sure that kids don't feel like if I have a 504, I have an IEP, that something is wrong with me as a learner. It's just helping them to understand that having those tools and those supports are what help them be able to demonstrate their best learning efforts. I would love one day to be able to reshape education and make it so that we just have best practices that meet all student needs. But for right now, making sure that students have the accommodations that make them be able to perform at their best is one of the most important things that we can do. And we'll talk about that more this evening as well. All right. Oh, sorry, I just skipped a whole bunch of things there. Didn't mean to do that. So this was my neurodivergent family tree that I was telling you about. I like to think of being neurodivergent is kind of a Venn diagram of overlapping a little bit. Everything is a little bit of a spectrum. You hear a lot of things where you don't quite differentiate. Okay, I have ADHD and I'm forgetful and, maybe I'm not as outgoing, but that can also fall into the category of somebody who has been diagnosed with autism as well. So I think it's important to realize that when you think of neurodivergent, there is this little bit of overlap. I can give you a really great example in the sense of like sensory processing disorder. I don't necessarily have a sensory processing disorder, but because of my ADHD, if I am in a crowded room and there's a lot of background noise going on, you could be sitting right next to me and having a conversation with me, and I am not getting everything that you're saying to me. And that's a sensory processing need, but that's because my brain is so busy trying to pay attention to you and everything else that I'm hearing go on in the room that I sometimes just miss that person who is directly talking to me right next to me. And so that's that sensory processing need. Again, that's not a diagnosis I have, but it does impact me being in that ADHD family. So just know that it's very common to see some overlap. If you tend to have ADHD, autism, sensory processing, there might be some other things at play too, because it really is more like a Venn diagram where everything kind of overlaps just a little bit in that neurodivergent family tree. I had a great video for you and I've had nothing but errors with it tonight. So I'll tell you a little bit about it. It was a TEDx talk by a wonderful person who talked about the hidden beauty of neurodiverse minds. Her name is Tasha Jackson. It was a TEDx talk at Lake Travis High School. So if you do have the opportunity to look it up, again, it was called The Hidden Beauty of the Neurodiverse Mind by Tasha Jackson. And she is a neurodiverse individual as well, or neurodivergent individual. And she talks about the brain a little bit more in depth. She talks about neurotypical brains versus neurodivergent brains. It really is a beautiful TED Talk. It's about 14 minutes long. If you have the opportunity to look it up, I highly recommend it. It just gives you a little bit more insight about that individual brain and some more information about it. So let's really get into collaboration. Now that we've kind of set the tone for what neurodivergence is, what that means, students who fall into that category, let's talk about collaboration as a keystone, especially when it comes to the education setting. So the first thing I want to talk about is this trio of support, and that's parents, advocates, if you work with an advocate, and it doesn't necessarily have to be an advocate like I am, I'm an advocate that you can hire, that you can bring to meetings with you, but maybe it's somebody who is your sister-in-law who happens to be a special education teacher and it's like, hey, I'll help you or I'll support you, or a community friend. So when I think of advocates, I think of anyone who is willing to stand up and say, hey, we need to do what's best for this child. So that is what I'm kind of talking about when I refer to advocates. But that trio of support is parents, advocates, and schools working together. And it's really, really important that those individuals do communicate clearly. I get to be a kind of what I call a third-party perspective on a regular basis as an advocate. I often sometimes will usually come in once things have already gotten frustrating between the parent and the school. And oftentimes as that third party perspective, I'm able to see that sometimes it was just a breakdown in communication that led to the frustration. Maybe, parents weren't clear on what some of the jargon was. The school didn't take the time to clearly explain what was happening. Maybe just communications weren't clear via, either email or Zoom meetings. So it's really important to have a collaborative approach that involves parents, it involves educators, it involves specialists, and really making sure that there is respect, open communication, and a shared goal of meeting the students' needs. Because at the end of the day, that's really what it's all about, right? Is making sure that student needs are being met. So let's talk about that role of an advocate. So really, if you're looking at an advocate, you want to help. You want to find somebody who can help you be guided through any procedures or processes, whether that's communicating with the school, whether that's the 504 process, whether that is the IEP. And again, I will get into those a little bit more in detail tonight. But making sure that your advocate is really well-versed. I have run into issues before where I've had someone who, in all good intentions, has, maybe been in one IEP meeting before and they go, oh, well, I can help you. I've done this before. And then they don't necessarily give the best advice or the best support. It's all well intended, but because it's not their background or their deep understanding, it sometimes can make things a little bit challenging. So if you do work with an advocate or a support person, making sure that their background is really clear in how to help you proceed forward, because there are a lot of procedural processes when it comes to the special education process, as far as timelines go, as far as the jargon goes. So you want to make sure that you are working with anybody, whether it's a family member or somebody that you hire to support you, who really understands the procedures and processes, so they don't already take a very confusing procedural process and make it that much harder for you. And then I also wanted to share a little bit about when to consider a special education lawyer versus an advocate. So as an advocate, I can help parents with their procedural processes, their timelines, reviewing IEPs. I sometimes do expert witness stuff. I can help in determining school environments, coming up with special education plans, rewriting IEPs. I really, in that special ed world as an advocate, I'm well-rounded. But when it starts to get into things that become disputes, that could become legal processes, where maybe you want to pull your child out of a school and you want to place them someplace else. If you feel like your needs have not been met and you want to go to some type of agreement or settlement with the school, that's when it's important to really consider a lawyer. I think oftentimes people think, oh, I immediately need to get paired up with a lawyer. Something went wrong at school, something's not working, let me reach out to a lawyer. And oftentimes that's kind of overkill at that point in time. Oftentimes, if you find a good advocate, an advocate can say, hold on, I can help you right the ship. These are the procedures and processes. This is what the meeting timelines look like. This is what you need to do as far as your next steps. And it doesn't need to involve a lawyer at that point in time. But I will say, as an advocate, I'm the first person to also raise my hand and tell the families I work with, okay, we're creeping out of my scope at this point in time. This is when you want to start working with a lawyer. And again, those are those procedures or processes where you feel like you need to take some type of legal action towards the school, that would be when to involve a lawyer. But if it's just, I think there's a misstep here, there's a collaboration issue, I don't feel like I'm being heard, those are all things that a good advocate can help you with. And it tends to be a lot more cost efficient and friendly on the pocketbook, which we all know is a thing nowadays, to work with an advocate versus immediately jumping to a lawyer. And then it's important to talk about the power of collaboration as well too. I think when you think about collaboration, at the end of the day, do you feel like there is a sense of relief, of stress? Working with as many parents that I do, I know it's very stressful to try and navigate some of these procedures and processes. I know that sometimes, understanding diagnosis is new to you. It's not something that you've ever had to navigate. So you're trying to support your child and be an advocate for your child, but you're also at a loss of what does that look like? What does that entail? So I always think that a good collaboration is when you feel like all that stress that's been sitting on your shoulders has come off a little bit. You feel like you finally have that team member that can help guide you, that you trust their opinion, and that the outcomes are coming the way now that you need them to be. And that doesn't necessarily mean that the outcome is exactly what you thought it was going to look like when you went into a meeting, but that you feel like there is forward movement, that you're being heard, that you are finally being able to start taking the steps in the right direction to get your child or your student what they need at the end of the day to be successful. All right, so I have a second poll question for you, just out of curiosity. Again, if you wouldn't mind using the chat feature just to let me know, what has been your experience in collaborating in schools for your child's education? So it can be a couple of these different answers, it can be one, it could be nothing at all, but just kind of getting a better idea from you at this point in time of what your experience has looked like. So I'm going to give everybody a minute. I know it takes a couple minutes to type these things in the chat. So, but share with me what your experience in collaborating with schools for your child's education has looked like. Has it been smooth and effective? Have you run into some challenges? Are you frustrated? Do you feel like you've hit a wall? Have you used an advocate before and you saw improvement? Have you used or considered a special education lawyer? Or maybe you haven't done anything yet, and that's what you're like, please answer some questions for me this evening because I'm trying to understand what I need to do. So I'm going to look at those as they come in. Oh, I'm so sorry to hear that. One of the worst experiences. Well, hopefully I can answer some questions this evening then and turn that around. Okay. Oh no. Well, that makes me sad to hear that bad experience. Again, my goal is hopefully to help you feel empowered and have a better idea. So please ask me questions as we go on this evening. I want to make sure that you walk away having a better sense by the end of this evening what steps you need to do to be successful for your child. All right. Just some, okay. Got it. Difficult and frustrating, improved somewhat. Communication's been frustrating. All right, so I'm seeing a lot of frustration, which I understand. This is not a process. This whole process is not anything that is simple or straightforward, especially if it's not in the realm that you live in. It's not something you're doing. I mean, I've lived in this world for 20 years, and I probably would say it probably took me a solid 12 years before I finally felt like I knew the mass majority of the things that I needed to know. So I can only imagine if that's not the world that you're living in, that it probably does feel frustrating, and it probably feels very lonely and isolating at times too. I know that that's a conversation I have with parents often, is that they feel very alone, like that you're the only person who is having to take on this burden or go through this challenge. And so I know that it probably doesn't provide any relief, but you're not alone. And we will talk about some collaboration and support systems tonight as well too. So sorry, I skipped over this. Let's talk about smooth transitions in education. And because those happen at a lot of different key points throughout your child's life, not only in school, but especially in special education. So I'm really going to take this kind of as an approach, talking about special education and some of those key transitions. So it's really important that we are obviously supporting our students through major educational transitions. And I would consider major educational transitions the following: when you're moving from elementary to middle school, when you're moving to middle to high school, when you're moving from high school into whatever your next phase in life is going to be. It could be college, it could be a support program, which I'll talk about a little bit more here in a minute. And then I also think that if you are already in the special education world, once your child hits the age of 14, so typically 8th grade, they also start to do a transition section on their IEP. And I'm going to talk about that just briefly for a second. So 8th grade, typically at 14 years old or whenever your child turns 14, that transition section of the IEP starts to get included. There's usually a teacher who, it could be in 8th grade, usually it's the case manager, will kind of do a survey, put some information into the IEP. But then once your child moves to high school, there typically tends to be a transition special education teacher, somebody who's more dedicated to making sure that you are getting linked with community supports, making sure that there's kind of a plan of action for what your child's plan in high school is going to look like, helping with, if there's summertime internship opportunities, if there are community supports that can be enacted. There's a big world of transition that can happen, especially in the special education world. And that's something to pay attention to on the IEP. Oftentimes, I think it gets glossed over, but it is important because that's really the trajectory to help set your child up for success after high school. But I also want you to know, too, that it's not something that is committing your child to, if they decide on their IEP transition that they're going to be an artist or they're going to be a graphic design, or they're not held accountable for the decision that they had that day that they were interviewed by the transition teacher. They are allowed to change their mind. They are allowed to look at different things. It's kind of what mood were they in sometimes the day that the transition teacher met with them, because I can tell you, I have been in many meetings where parents go, I had no idea my child wanted to do this. They've never talked about this before. This is on their IEP and this is news to me. So don't be upset. It could just be that your child happened to see a video, talk to a friend or something, and that's the day the transition teacher interviewed them, and that was the topic that was stuck in their head. So by no means is your child obligated to follow through on that transition path. It's really just meant to have an idea of what that path is going to look like going forward. So just summing that up for the transition aspect. But let's also talk about when we're moving from elementary to middle to high school. If your child already has an IEP, one of the biggest things that I always recommend, even if you've just recently had your annual IEP, maybe your annual was in February, I always recommend, if your child is in 5th grade or 8th grade, that you come back at the end of the school year, typically around late April, May, and you have a meeting with your school team and you ask them to invite whoever the special ed department head is for the middle school or the high school that they're going to be transitioning to also participate in that meeting. That's an opportunity for you to ask questions about what expectations are going to look like, what procedures and processes, selecting schedules, supports and services. That's an opportunity for you to ask a lot of questions of that person who is essentially getting handed the baton of the IEP in the middle school or at the high school level. And I think it's important to ask questions that you might have related to services, related to schedule, related to case manager. I think it's a time to also talk about what pull-out services or interventions they offer, if that's something that is services on your child's IEP. I think that's also a time to just find out if there are going to be summer opportunities for your child to come in and tour. Oftentimes the high schools, middle schools do that week before school starts. Usually there's a day where they can come in and tour the building, but sometimes that's not enough for every child. Some children need something that's a little bit less overwhelming. They need to have established a trusted adult. They need to be able to have walked into the building and seen it maybe with their parent with them when there's not as many people there. So those are great opportunities to talk to that person who will be receiving the IEP and say, hey, what else can I do? When can I come up during the summer with my child before that day that everybody comes to tour the building? What trusted adult can I start establishing relationships with for my child, because that's something that's really meaningful to them? And those are all really great questions to have. So if you are not naturally being offered an opportunity to have what I'm calling like that middle school or high school transition meeting at the end of the school year, I would recommend that you reach out to your school team and ask them to set something like that up. Some teams automatically do it, sometimes teams don't, but I think if you feel like it would be helpful, there's no reason why you shouldn't ask for a meeting like that. And if you feel like you need something beyond just that typical week before school, everybody rides the bus, walks through the building type of thing, then that's a time to also talk about that and ask questions about how can I get up there with my child and have them the opportunity to see the building so that they're not feeling overwhelmed or anxious on that first day of school. I also want to talk about pathway to independence programs too. So what I mean by pathway to independence programs, I'm going to kind of leave the college programming for the last thing, but pathways to independence programs are also programs that exist. You almost think of them as like a therapeutic boarding school. They're programs that exist throughout the country that are not necessarily a college program, but they were a program for students who they're ready to leave the house, but maybe they're not ready for that full independence that we know comes with college. Maybe their executive functioning, maybe their decision-making skills, maybe there's just a little bit of concern. You know that they're ready to move on, but they're not ready to be purely independent. And so there are programs throughout the country that offer what I call these pathways to independence programs. Sometimes there are educational components attached with them. It could be where they have a partnership with the local college, community college, that your child is still taking college credits or courses at the local community college, and they're living independently in a program that is also helping them with maybe mental health needs, with an executive functioning, with kind of just getting an idea of what they want their future to look like moving forward. So those are just an option that exists out there that you could look into if you felt like, okay, my child is ready to move on, but they're not quite ready for that college independence aspect yet in their life either. But there are some college programs as well that I do want to point out, that there are specialty college programs that do exist. There's disability services that every college for the most part has. It's important to note that although you can bring an IEP to the college disability services program and show it to them and show these, this is what my child had. And I would encourage your child to be the one doing this at the college level. But if they need your support, they need your support. But I would say you can show it to them, but know that colleges don't necessarily take an IEP and implement an IEP. You are definitely going to get a very reduced level of support. There's note-taking support. There's things where your child can record the lecture, but it's definitely a much more watered down. It's not like you transfer an IEP to the college. They will provide supports and services, but it looks significantly different. There is still very much a need for self-advocacy, for independence, and they're much more mild accommodations than what your child may have been used to via their IEP in the education setting. However, with that said, and I'm going to kind of linger here on this page for a second, there are some special college programs, and there's more beyond what I have just listed on this particular site. I kind of highlighted more autism college programs on this site, but please know there are additional ones. But I wanted you to be able to see that there are sites that you can go to that will list colleges, but then I also listed some of the colleges themselves below that have some of the programs there. And these are specialty programs at the college level, but they are really tailored for students who might have disabilities or need more additional support at the college level. It is important to note that some of these programs do lead to a bachelor's degree. Some of them lead to an associate's degree. So it's important that you do the research into the program before you make any type of commitment. But I think oftentimes parents are surprised to learn that there are colleges that offer specific programming for students with different learning needs. So I'm just going to linger here for a second, just in case you're trying to write down any of those URLs or any of those programs, and then I'll move on to the next slide.
Dr. Eccleston, I also put a link to a copy of the presentation in the chat, so no one has to furiously scribble things down.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. I think I may have added this slide late because I was going to talk about it. And I was like, well, you might be helpful to add it, but I will put my email address at the end. So if for any reason you didn't get this or you can't find this, email me and I'll make sure that I send it to you.
Great. Thank you.
All right, it's time for another poll question. I do appreciate when everyone chimes in because, again, it helps me kind of tailor things in the right direction for everyone. So as you're thinking about your child's future transitions, which areas are you most concerned about? So is it adjusting to new routines and environments? Is it ensuring continuity of academic support and accommodations? Is it the communication and planning between current and future educational institutions? Is it them being able to make friends, being able to access the college disability services, finding and engaging with programs that are structured for post-high school support? Or is it that just having that effectiveness of transition planning and support from education professionals? And it could be more than one thing. Academic accommodations. Okay. Accommodations, support, knowledge, communication. Excellent. And I will say again, if you're looking at your child is college bound and they are going to go off to college, there is a disability services at every college. I just don't want there to be any kind of shock when, they don't take the IEP and accommodate, implement it at its full level. They are not required to do so. It is very rare unless maybe you go into one of those specialty programs to see that done. But I think it's really important for you to identify with your child when they are transitioning from high school to college. What are those areas that I really still need support with? Is it that executive functioning? And if it's executive functioning, potentially working with your child or executive functioning coach to identify what's the best organizational system for me. Do I need to have folders? Do I need to use some type of technology? How can I keep myself organized to make sure that I'm hitting those deadlines, due dates for all my college assignments? If it's something with note taking, maybe, can I get copy of notes? I know back in my day when I was in college, I often was a note taker for different students, and we still were using that carbon copy paper. Hopefully they have moved beyond carbon copy paper at this point in time, but making sure that they get paired up with the right peers. And oftentimes it can be anonymous. Just so that you are aware of there's questions with that. Not everybody wants to make it known that they need this support. I always tell people embrace it, but I get too that maybe you don't want to advertise it to everyone. So there should be something where the disability services can set up where if there is a peer who is taking notes or providing notes to your student, that those notes either get turned into the professor or to the disability services and then provided to your student that way. So there's kind of a third party intermediate individual. But I think it's important to identify what are the specific accommodations that were the most beneficial to your child via their IEP. They're not going to get everything that was always in that IEP. So really identifying those common core ones that were really supportive and helpful for your child will be the best plan of action, so that when your child or you and your child meet with the college disability services and they talk about what they can or cannot do, you already have a clear idea too. It's like, this is what my child needs to be successful. So if you don't do it exactly like this, what version or form of this accommodation can be provided to make sure my child gets what they need? All right. So I'm going to jump into 504s and IEPs a little bit. And this is a section where I'm actually going to pause once I kind of talk about it and open it up to questions, because I imagine there's probably a lot of questions about 504s and IEPs. So let's talk about the
Eccleston, there's a quick question. Do you want to answer it now, or do you want to wait until the end? It's related back to your college comments.
Sure. If I missed it, I'm more than happy to answer it now.
Actually, Janie, you want to ask it yourself?
I think I found. Can a person?
You're on mute, Miss Payne.
Did you see it? I talked about getting support, right? And what happens when the child reaches 21? How do you think about the support? Can a person who gets support from DDA actually go to college, right? Or will you lose the ability to get that kind of financial support that you need?
That's a really good question. I'm going to be honest. I don't know that I have personally come up against that scenario before, so I don't want to say anything that would point you in the wrong direction. But given some of the specialty college programs that exist, that screen that I popped up there a few minutes ago, I think that would actually be, now I'm going to do my own research. So if you want to connect with me afterwards, because now I need to answer this question for my own burning desire of understanding. So we can always connect later if you would like. But I have never heard, I would imagine that if a program is tailored specifically to what the student's level of need or support is, I would hate to think that they would punish them by removing any type of funding. Now, what I think is best and how the world should function is not always how the world functions. So I don't want to, again, I don't want to lead you astray in any type of way. I'd rather find the concrete answer for you. But I would hope that they are specialty programs that are designed to meet the unique needs of an individual, that they wouldn't take any type of funding away. But please, let's connect after this, because I now would like to find out that answer as well. And make sure that you have the answer to that question.
Thank you.
All right, so talking about 504s versus IEPs. So the first thing is I want to share a little bit about the difference between a 504 and an IEP, because I think this often comes up. I will have parents who come to me and they go, I need to get my child an IEP. And then when we kind of get into it a little bit more, it's like, well, I actually think your child would benefit more from a 504. So let's talk about the difference of that. So when you think of a 504, think about what support is it that my child needs to be essentially on that same playing field as other children. I'm not sure if you've ever seen it, and I should have included this visual, but this is one of the visuals that I constantly think of. It's children who are kind of looking over a fence, and they're all standing on different sized boxes. You know, one child needed a really big box and one child only needed an itty bitty box. But once they were all standing on their different sized boxes, they all had the same view of the baseball field over the fence. And so when I think about 504s and IEPs, that's what I'm thinking about. What supports and accommodations does this child need in order to be at the same playing field as everybody else educationally and to be successful? And when we're looking at a 504, we're looking purely at accommodations. What accommodations does that child need to be successful? Do they need maybe an alternative way to demonstrate learning? Do they need to have a reduced workload? Do they need to have a menu of coping strategies when they become emotionally dysregulated? What is it that they need as an accommodation to support them? Versus an IEP is, what type of individualized instruction do they need? What do they need to be taught that is a skill set deficit or something that is missing right now? And then that's really the core difference between a 504 and an IEP, because an IEP has accommodations, and an IEP has supplementary aids and services associated with it. So a 504 is just those accommodations where you can get those accommodations on an IEP, but then the IEP takes it to the next level of, what does my child need to specifically be taught as a skill in order to make sure that they're on that same playing field? And so that could be a reading, a writing, a math, and sometimes it's a social emotional need, and sometimes it's an executive functioning need, but it's a skill set deficit that there needs to be direct type of instruction given. So you're not getting any kind of instruction or a individualized instruction with a 504. You're just solely getting accommodations. So for example, let's say your child is diagnosed with ADHD. And the ADHD, to manage it and for them to be successful in the education setting, they need to have extended time and they need to have an alternative way of demonstrating learning. So I'm keeping this very simple as far as my examples go. Please know it could be much more complex. But what you would do is you would go and see someone who is certified in making that diagnosis. Oftentimes, your pediatrician can make a formal diagnosis of ADHD. There's rating scales. Oftentimes, you'll complete them as a parent. You'll send them into the school. The school will complete them. But you just need to get some type of formal diagnosis. You're a pediatrician, a neuropsychiatrist, psychologist, and have that documentation to say, hey, my child is, has this diagnosis. You meet with the 504 team. You talk about how this is impacting them educationally. I'm going to use my daughter as an example. In third grade, they would do those multiplication math tests where they would give them 3 minutes to answer 40 or 50 multiplication questions. And I mean, it was timed. And at the end of 3 minutes, my daughter would have only gotten through maybe 15 of the 50 different multiplication questions. And she would come home really upset and really defeated that, she was getting them wrong. She was only able to get through 15 in the 3 minutes. And then eventually we implemented a 504. She got extended time and she went from having 3 minutes to 4 minutes. So only 1 extra minute. But she then went from only getting through 15 of them to getting through 45 or 48 out of the 50 of them. So just having that additional processing time is what she needed in order to be at that same playing field. And so having that 504, going to the 504 team, talking about what the educational impact is, what type of accommodations need to be put in place. It's a very, I call it a quick process because compared to the IEP process, which we'll get into in a second, it is much faster, but it's something that you can put into effect. Now, I do want you to know that just because you get a 504 doesn't mean that later down the line you can't get an IEP, and I'll talk about that in a second. But right now, getting a 504 is getting that diagnosis, getting that turned into the school, having that meeting, and talking about what accommodations need to be put into place, because what is the educational impact? Because sometimes my other child, my son has ADHD. He does not have a 504. His ADHD does not impact him educationally, and so he did not get a 504 for that. So that's something to keep in mind too. So anytime you're looking at a 504, there needs to be some type of educational impact that is also occurring with the diagnosis. Versus an IEP, we're looking at what type of deficit is happening. Is there a learning disability that is occurring in a specific area of reading, writing, math? Is the educational impact the fact that they are not able to access school? One thing that I like to touch on, and I like to make very clear, especially given the world that I work in, and I predominantly work with parents of students who are struggling with mental health needs in the education setting, is it does not have to just be an academic deficit in order for it to be an IEP. If your child's deficit is the executive functioning, which is just making them, maybe they can't keep anything straight, they're failing all of their classes because their organization is there, that's a deficit that needs to be taught. We have to be taught executive functioning skills sometimes. Sometimes children are incredibly bright. I run into this scenario all the time, where the child is, testing off the charts as far as intelligence go. They're well above grade level, maybe several grade levels ahead. Maybe their grades even look somewhat okay because they're so highly intelligent or cognitively capable, but they don't go to school because their anxiety is so impactful that they are school avoidant. Or when they are there, it's very hard for them to engage in peers, or they've had a history of hospitalizations that have occurred that have impacted their time at school. So an IEP does not have to just be academically focused. If your child is struggling with executive functioning needs or social emotional needs, there can be IEPs that solely just have social emotional or executive functioning supports. It does not have to be purely academic. It can maybe be a blend. It can be purely academic, but I like to point that out because I think that's one of the biggest challenges that parents often face is your child is struggling. Maybe your child has even had a 504 plan for a period of time and there's been accommodations, and even with those accommodations, your child is still not performing well or is still struggling. That would be a time to start talking about looking at, is the 504 plan enough? Is it enough to just have accommodations or supports? Or do we need to look at an IEP? Do we need to look at the educational impact of the fact that my child can't get up and go to school? I will say that oftentimes in my career, it's come up that, the state of Maryland puts it on the parent to make sure that your child is getting to school attendance wise. But in all honesty, if your child is impacted by a mental health need, to me, that's the same thing as having a critical health condition, cancer or something else that is going on. Your child is being impacted and needs support. And that support could be on how to emotionally regulate. It could be that executive functioning piece. So if your child has had a 504 for a period of time and those accommodations have not been enough, there's nothing wrong with saying to the team, and you have the right as a parent to request an IEP screening. You sometimes will hear it be called an IEP screening. You'll sometimes hear it be called a child find meeting. They're kind of one and the same. But essentially, you are looking at having a meeting with the school. And again, as a parent, you can request it. And you are asking them to look at the educational impact. Oftentimes, the meeting starts with kind of you as a parent getting to share what you feel like is happening, what your concerns are. Then the team will kind of dive into sharing, grades, attendance, data. But it's important if you feel like, my child has good grades, my child is smart, but my child is not able to engage. They come home, they mask all day because of their autism or their ADHD. They're exhausted, they're not able to social function. Or a lot of what I hear too is children will do okay at school all day, and then the second they get home, it's just like an unraveling. And it's because they masked all day at school, and now that they're home and in their safe space, it's a lot, and the parent's not sure what to do. And I think oftentimes you hear schools go, well, that's not happening here. But it's really important that if things are happening with your child because of what's happening at school, they're masking all day at school, they're not feeling engaged with peers, they're struggling to get there, even though you're kind of seeing that unraveling happening at home, there still is that connection to school. So it's really important that you tie back to what you're seeing at home, how it is related to what is going on at school. So I did talk a little bit too about obtaining a 504 plan. So let's just talk about the process and procedures real quick for an IEP too. So like I said, either the school team or you as a parent can request an IEP meeting. I usually think of it as being kind of a 3-part process. It's usually, I like to say, if things go as planned the way they should, you're usually looking at a 90-day process. And usually that is because you have that IEP screening or child find meeting. Again, one and the same. At that meeting, then the team determines, do we feel like there's deficits? What data do we need to collect? So then typically that will be where the team will ask you to sign off on providing authorization for an educational assessment and a psychological assessment. The school team then has 60 days to complete that assessment, and then come back for another meeting. And then at that IEP determinations meeting, then we usually go through the educational assessment, we usually go through the psychological, we talk as a team, what does this mean? What does this look like? Does your child then indeed qualify for special education services? If the answer is no, and you disagree, then there's a whole slew of procedures and processes that you can do to implement your due process rights. But let's, for this theory, say that the team agrees, yes, they qualify for special education. Then the team then gets an additional 30 days to develop the initial IEP, come back for that initial IEP meeting. And then once that IEP has been finalized and you have signed off, and you typically only have to sign off that first time authorizing the initiation of that IEP, then it becomes official. And that's typically a 90-day process. The only time that would change is if for any reason you did outside assessment. So if you did a full neuropsych, maybe with the STIX-RUD group or a different group, there's so many in the area, and you did an assessment, a full neuropsych prior to going into that IEP screening meeting, oftentimes school teams, if there is no need for additional data or additional questions, can combine that IEP screening meeting and determinations meeting into one meeting because they already have that assessment data. Again, that doesn't guarantee that they might not have more questions or might not want more assessments, but typically if it's a full thorough neuropsych, those meetings can be combined, and then you're looking at 30 days for developing that IEP. And then again, beyond academics, I know I've talked on this a lot, but I always like to kind of harp on this. You don't have to purely have an academic deficit. If your child is school avoidant, is dealing with emotional dysregulation, dealing with self-advocacy issues, and that is what's impacting their ability to be successful, IEPs can be developed in areas outside of academics if that is the deficit that your child is facing, and that is the skill that they need direct instruction on. So I'm gonna bring up this comment because I think it's a good one. Sorry, I just kind of looked over and I saw it, and you said, much easier said than done. My daughter's school relies on what's happening at school more than what's happening at home. I don't disagree with what you were saying, but that is where you have to push back. And that's where sometimes working with an advocate can be helpful, or you as a parent, it's pushing back and it's helping the school team to understand that I understand that you are not seeing what I am seeing at home, but that is because my child is masking. That is because my child's diagnosis, ADHD, autism, they mask all day and they hold it together. And then when they get home, they fall apart. What I think you can do too to support, if you are working with outside providers, I think it's always helpful to get letters from outside providers that is kind of reinforcing what you're saying. So it's not just you saying it. You have your providers who are providing that information, who are documenting it. But I think you have to push back on the school team when stuff like that happens, because again, you're right. They're saying, hey, we're not seeing it. But if what is happening at school is directly impacting your child when they get home from school, then that still becomes something that needs to be addressed at school. Your child should be able to come home from school and still be functional and not unravel and fall apart. Masked at school. And yes, that is exactly what is happening. You know, oftentimes with ADHD and the masking, you start to learn like, this is how I'm supposed to look. This is how I'm supposed to present myself. And then what happens is when you get to your safe space, and oftentimes home and parents are your safe space, you just can't hold it together anymore. And the school needs to be aware of that, because then that means there might be something at a school that needs to be happening where either coping strategies are being put into the 504 IEP. One of my favorite accommodations that I use for 504s and IEPs is a menu of coping strategies developed with a trusted adult. And I'll tell you why that wording is important, because one, I want your child to have a menu of coping strategies so that if they are in the middle of being dysregulated or upset, we're not trying to figure out in that moment what they need to calm down. They have already identified at a time when they were in a good place, these are the things that work for me. And now they just have to point to a menu that, you know, is maybe laminated, kept in their desk, in their notebook, or with the teacher, and say, this is what I need. And then the other part of that, developed with a trusted adult, is to make sure that somebody is accountable for making sure that menu of coping strategies gets developed. So either the school counselor, the case manager, but somebody is being held accountable. Sometimes I even go as deep as saying with the counselor or with the case manager instead of trusted adult. So it is clearly identified on who that person is who is going to help develop that coping strategy menu. Okay. So I'm going to pause here for a second. I know I gave a lot of information up to this point, and especially on 504s or IEPs. So I am going to have a general question and answer again, whatever time we have about 30 more minutes together. So whatever time is left at the end, I will leave that purely for Q&A. But I know that sometimes we want to get questions out, especially if it's something we just talked about. So I'm going to pause here for a second. If you have any questions specific to 504s or IEPs, go ahead and put that in the chat for me now. I want to make sure I address this, and I'm going to scroll to make sure I didn't miss any questions that came in while I was sharing information with everyone. Providing that's it took us 2 years even providing. And you're right. I'm not sure. And when you say it took us 2 years, even with providing a psychoeducational assessment, did it take you 2 years to get an IEP? Is it one of those scenarios where I was talking about where it was more than just a cognitive need, it was a social emotional need, and that was the struggle? Because that is something that I work specifically on. As I shared, my kind of niche area, if you work with me ever as an advocate, I truly only tend to work with families that have that mental health or that neurodivergent component. And I'll kind of pause here while people are chatting or putting in their questions, that when you're neurodivergent, it doesn't mean that you have a mental health need. They're not mutually exclusive to one another, but oftentimes they do go hand in hand, because when you're neurodivergent, I talked about masking. And for anyone who's like, what do you mean when you say masking? Masking is literally what it sounds like. You kind of put on this mask for the day, you act the way that you're supposed to, the way that you know you're supposed, society expects from you. But then it takes a lot of brain energy, because it's not kind of your natural state. It's not who you really are. So that's kind of like when you get home at the end of the day, you're just exhausted, you feel overwhelmed, because you kind of had to keep up this facade that wasn't really you. And so I run into that a lot. And that's why I kind of dedicated that to being my specialty area, is because I saw the frustration, even when I was still a public school teacher, that parents would run into, of just feeling like, my child has these needs, they're smart, they're capable, but there's something else going on that's holding them back from their academic potential. And so one of the other things that I often say too, if you have a child who is academically capable, I often say to the school team, okay, they're doing well, but are they performing at the level they can be performing at, or they should be performing at? And so using that educational or that neuropsych assessment to say, this is what this child, is testing as being able to. Yeah, they have an A, but you don't have them in a higher level math. You don't have them in a higher level course, which their testing clearly shows they're capable of doing. So they're performing well at something that's not hard for them. So they're not actually getting an opportunity to perform at the level that they're capable of because these other factors are holding them back right now. We've got to address these other factors. And I will say too, my research when I was getting my doctorate was specifically in mental health in the education setting. And oftentimes what happens, it goes back to this kind of collaboration communication piece we talked about in the beginning, is people just don't know. You don't know what you don't know, right? And even educators, there are new things that come out all the time about different neurodivergent needs, learning needs. And if you're just not aware of some of the concepts or some of the red flags, because this is kind of a generally new explosion that has happened over the last, I would say, decade, then sometimes what I'm doing as an advocate is helping to bridge the gap of understanding to the school team and kind of open up a new perspective to them of how they should be looking at what is happening with this child. I'm going to go out of turn here because I'm trying to give everybody an opportunity to put their questions in. But one thing that I come across often in the work that I do are children who are on the autism spectrum, and they get labeled as having an emotional disability because they become dysregulated at school. And sometimes it can be huge meltdowns or huge dysregulations at school. And then they kind of get pigeonholed as having an emotional disability. They get put into programs for social emotional needs, and then they don't do well there either. And it just becomes this frustrating cycle. And so one of the things that I often try to work with school teams and understanding is, it's not that this child has an emotional disability. Yes, it is manifesting into an emotional disability, but what is actually happening is us as adults often want to fix things right away. A child is having a bad day, a bad moment, a thing, and we want to jump in, we want to process with them right away, and we want to fix it right away and move on. But a lot of children, especially neurodivergent children, aren't ready for that. They need that processing time. One of the biggest things that you see on testing that comes back is usually children who are neurodivergent have a slower processing speed. And again, it's not because their processing is slow. It's usually because they're trying to take in so much information that they need that extra time to kind of process through it. But they need that time to process. They often get overstimulated by being asked a lot of questions. Are you okay? What's going on? Let's work through this. That becomes overwhelming, overstimulating, especially if there's peers around, if the lighting is not right, so many different factors. And what ends up happening is the adult who is trying to fix the situation ultimately ends up what I like to call poking the bear. And then the kid finally melts down or explodes. And it's not, again, because they have an emotional disability, it's because they were overstimulated and then brought to their breaking point. And I think oftentimes people don't realize that, or that doesn't come to mind right away. And it's kind of once we offer that new perspective of this is what's going on, that light bulb goes off, and then we can plan accordingly for what that child needs to be successful. But sometimes it's needing to kind of break things down and helping them understand that your attempt to be helpful is actually becoming more detrimental to the child. It would be better to let them have 15 minutes in a quiet space for them to help regulate themselves and calm down, and then ask them if they're ready to process or problem solve, rather than just keep poking the bear until they finally explode. Okay, so bingo, thank you. I'm glad we see eye to eye. Addressing accommodations when a child is twice exceptional. So can you give me a little bit more information? So addressing accommodations when a child is twice exceptional, because even though I'm going to kind of, until you clarify, I'm going to talk about twice exceptional. So we know, if you're not familiar with the twice exceptional or 2E, those are children who are incredibly smart, but also could have a learning disability as well. And so accommodations, what I would say for children like that, one of my favorites is alternative ways to demonstrate understanding. Because really, when it comes down to education, the whole idea of homework, of projects, of classwork is all, can the student demonstrate mastery or understanding? The teacher has taught a concept. Can the student now show and demonstrate that they understand that concept? And oftentimes what happens with 2E students or twice exceptional students is they understand the concept, but the way in which you are asking them to demonstrate their understanding, it just doesn't align or is not compatible with how their brain, it goes back to what we talked about in the beginning, their brain is just different in the way it processes and takes in information. And so what we need is, you know, instead of it being a PowerPoint presentation, maybe my child is very artistic. Can they do a poster? Instead of getting up and having to do a presentation in front of the entire class, can it be something where it's one-on-one with the teacher and they do it that way? If it's something where it's a paper, is there flexibility in for them to be able to use a topic that they have interest of versus whatever the general topic is that was assigned? And I know I'm giving kind of higher level examples. It's hard to pinpoint when it's not specific to a certain child, but that's one of my favorite things, because I think oftentimes we overlook, we just go, this is the way we want it, and it's our rigidity as an adult. And so we need to help the school team understand that there needs to be a little bit of flexibility. The child can demonstrate their mastery, but can you give them a different outlet in which to do so? How to address the IEP team when the parent and school disagree on the anticipated graduation date. IEP notes earlier than 21. So I want to make sure, I'm going to reread that just to make sure I understand. So your question is how to address the IEP team when the parent and school disagree on the anticipated graduation date. IEP notes earlier than 21. So you do have the right in the state of Maryland. So if you have a child who has an IEP, they do have the age to the age of 21 to graduate. Sometimes they don't need it. Sometimes it's something where they graduate at 18, you know, they just needed the supports and services while they were going through. Sometimes the need is more profound, so it's beneficial for them to stay in the school system until they're 21, you know, a little bit of maturity, a little bit of additional services and support, especially for some of our students who might benefit from community support, life skills support. But I'm trying to understand. So if you disagree with the anticipated graduation date, I'm going to give a general answer to this. So if you ever disagree with anything on the IEP, you have the right to exercise your due process rights. Typically, there is a resolution and compliance unit or an office within central office that you can go to if you feel like a decision was made on the IEP that you don't agree with. Typically, what I like to start with is mediation before we go into hearings or anything like that, because oftentimes if you meet with the school team and then there's usually a third party person who is brought in, it's like an administrative law clerk type of person, third party, not associated with the school system. They come in and they mediate. You're looking to find that agreement between the school team and you as a parent. What can we fix? What can we mediate to make sure that we're in alignment? So that's usually one of the first things you can do. But then if you don't feel like mediation is successful, then that's when you can go to like a hearing process. That's when I usually go, hey, we're out of my scope. This is when you might want to check in with a special education lawyer once we kind of move past mediation and go into the hearing processes. But you don't ever have to agree. I know oftentimes what happens is you are there, it's an IEP team meeting. You've got 10 people from the school and you feel like you're the only person there as the parent representative. The team kind of makes this decision and you don't really feel like you have any recourse to come back and disagree, but don't feel like you have to accept it. If you do ever feel like there is a disagreement, first, I think it's worth just reaching out to whoever you work with at the school and saying, hey, I disagree. This is why. And then if you don't feel like they're being receptive to that, then you do have the right to exercise for mediation to try and find a common ground with that third party person associated with it. What is it called? I have a question here. What is it called? Alternative learning methods. Oh, for the accommodation that I mentioned earlier, it was alternative ways to demonstrate learning. And that's kind of the common universal that you see on IEPs, alternative ways to demonstrate learning. Okay, I have one more question here. My child struggles with accepting her neuro. She feels being labeled as what she calls that is negative and bad for her, which makes it more challenging to provide supports for her and for her to benefit from the supports. Can you recommend any strategies or approaches to change her perception? As a parent, watching her falling behind because she looks down on some of the support is disheartening. Yes, so I'm going to read that clearly because I wanted to make sure. So it says, my child struggles with accepting her neurodivergence, feels being labeled as what she calls SPED, special education, is negative and bad for her, which makes it more challenging to provide supports for her and for her to benefit from the supports. Can you recommend any strategies or approaches to change her perceptions? As a parent, watching her falling behind because she looks down on some of the supports is disheartening. And someone said, my daughter feels the same way. So I run into this all the time. Because you're right, there is a stigma and a label, especially for some of our students who, they come across as a typically developing, but, we have that ADHD or that autism 1 diagnosis. And, having a 504 or an IEP then feels like, what is wrong with me? It creates that thought process of, is there something wrong with me as a learner? And I don't want to be called out. We're at that age, right, where as teenagers, nobody wants to be different. Nobody wants to be called out or feel different or look at that in any kind of way. And that's a common thing that has come up. And so I recommend, I'm going to do a really shameless plug here. My husband told me not to do it, so forgive me. I'm going to do it anyways. If you look up my name on YouTube and put in TEDx, I did a TEDx talk, and I did it specifically about my story. And I talked about having gone through school as somebody who was undiagnosed with ADHD and what that felt like for me and how I felt horrible about myself. And it took me almost a decade to come with terms of like, wait a minute, I actually am way more capable than I ever thought I was because I went through school feeling different and something was wrong. And so I think sharing stories like that with your child, and even if it's not my story, if you ever felt that way as a student, and I always encourage teachers too, because I feel like teachers don't often share their stories. Like if you were a teacher or a parent who ever felt that way in school, talk about that with your child. Let them know that you felt different and, you didn't necessarily want people to know that you felt different, because I was that way. I didn't want my peers to think something was wrong with me as a learner. Why couldn't I get the same grades that they could get, type of thing? And so you really do try to hide it, and you start to really impact your self-esteem. And that was one of the things I hate. I hate seeing young people feel like something is wrong with them when it's not. And part of the TEDx, what I talked about is how education is a one size fits all. And I really feel like if you can talk to your child about how education right now, just the way the education setting is, we haven't really updated it from how it was established 200 some years ago. And so it really is this one size fits all. And if your brain is a brain that learns differently, not everybody does well with sitting and having somebody just talk at them for an hour, right? Then that's hard. Sometimes we need movement. We need project-based learning. We need kinesthetic, using our hands. We need different ways to learn. And oftentimes school is just not equipped or set up for that. And so I think if you can talk to your child about the fact that it's not really them, it's just that the environment that they're in is not conducive really for how their brain as an individual works, I think those are really powerful and important conversations to have. And then talk to them about the future. Most of our neurodivergent students are really good and really bright and really on top of things that are areas of interest to them. And so talk about like when they get to be able to kind of get through high school and they get to start turning towards looking at what their passions are, no matter what it is, they're going to see a complete 180 in who they are as themselves. Because that's really when it came about for me, was when I finally got to college and I got through all those gen ed courses you had to get through, because I struggled with those too. But once I could really focus on the things that were interesting to me, I excelled. And it was this huge 180. And I often try to have those conversations with students that it's unfortunate side effect of the setting that they're in, but it's not them. So, and most of the time their peers have no idea that they have a 504 or IEP. I used to, when I was a special ed teacher, I would pull kids, to come do testing or things with me in a different room. And I always try to be really discreet about it because I didn't want to, in case they were sensitive about it. And I would have their friends who didn't have services go, well, can I go with you too? They had no idea why I was pulling these kids. They had no idea. So oftentimes I think it's more of a self-conscious thing that the kids think the peers have this, or not the peers themselves are wearing like these big flashing signs to say, hey, I've got services. Hey, I've got this. but none of their peers know. So if you can help reinforce that, help them know that it's not a them thing, it's a setting thing, and that their future, when they get to be able to look at what they're interested in, is going to be a completely different story for them. And share some of your stories and have teachers share their stories. I think that can be really, really powerful. I'm sorry, I had a couple more questions that came in. Let's see. My daughter has done great with OT, but we are looking for behavioral therapy to add to the OT to help with the emotional struggles. That's something too to also look at in the school, you know, social emotional services or counseling services. Some schools have social workers assigned to it. Sometimes special ed programs are unique in the sense that they have a social worker assigned to them. Sometimes it's a counselor, but there can be counseling services that are put on the IEP if your child does need additional support with maybe that emotional regulation, you know, making peer connections, that self-advocacy. Those are services that can be a type of service like OT or speech as well. Do I know any age-appropriate resources that she could look to understand how her brain works differently? She's 12 and has ADHD and dyslexia. There is actually a really great book that talks about ADHD in girls, and I'm just gonna slide here. My library is right next to me. You as a parent, it might be helpful. Oh man, I blurred my screen, so I'll say it's called Understanding Girls with ADHD, and it's by Kathleen G. Nadeo. I'm sure I'm saying that wrong. It's spelled Nadeau. And it's Understanding Girls with ADHD. It's a great book. And it talks about the different elementary, middle, high school, how it can appear, what it can look like, because there is not a lot of research. Most of any research that's ever been done on ADHD has typically been done with males. So it's a great book. And then it might be something that you could even then use as a resource or a conversation starting point with your child about helping them to understand their brain. But I also recommend TED Talks. And again, not if it's not mine, if it's the Tasha one that I shared at the beginning, there's so many great TED Talks about neurodiversity, and hearing people's stories, I think, can be really powerful to other children so that they know they're not alone. Because I think that's often what it comes from, is they feel very alone, like they're the only one who are having these struggles. So advocacy for empowerment. So talking just a little bit about advocacy and some of the things that you as a parent can advocate for, having an advocate. But when I'm saying advocate, it's just kind of putting it out there. I'm going to go through these a little bit faster because this didn't seem like a huge area of interest, but something just worth noting. And I want to be mindful of time too and be able to ask any additional question or answer any additional questions. But I do want to point out that when we're looking at emotional disabilities too, there is a huge difference between what I like to call internalizing versus externalizing. Your internalizing students are students who definitely, you don't really see it. It's that inward, that's that school avoidance, that anxiety, that depression, versus our students who are externalizers. And it's very known that something is bothering them. They make it very known. It could be their language, you know, their actions within the classroom. It could all be coming from a place of anxiety, depression, or a mental health need, but it's all just how it is manifested internally or externally. And oftentimes with behavioral supports, for a long time, and I really haven't seen a lot of places that do it anywhere differently, we oftentimes group students with emotional disabilities together, but sometimes for our internalizing friends, that can be very overwhelming to be with peers who have externalizing needs. So that's something definitely that if your child is truly dealing with emotional disability and you're working with the school to find the right supports and services, if they are an internalizing student, making sure that whatever programming they're putting in, ask questions about the other students. Not in the sense that, you know, schools cannot provide you like detailed information about students' diagnosis or things like that, but just talk about what is the setting, how do you navigate, you know, students who are more internalizing versus externalizing, because there are times when students who are internalizing are put with students who are externalizing, and it becomes incredibly overwhelming for them, and it becomes something that is hard for them to then navigate being in that program and being successful. And that kind of goes hand in hand with red flags and understanding what internalizing looks like. Oftentimes that gets missed the most, especially by teachers. So if you're seeing kids who are, not engaging, who are disengaged, who are school avoidant, who are academically capable, but are, just struggling to engage or get their work done, those start to be some of those key red flags to start looking for. Again, a school avoidance, I tend to put school avoidance into two camps. Usually one camp is students who it's very much a setting piece. And so that anxiety of being in a comprehensive building can be incredibly overwhelming. So needing to find a different type of environment versus students who it becomes more of a non-preferred task. They don't like school. They don't want to be there. It's, maybe they don't feel good about themselves when they're there. People are not pushing them to have to go to school. So it's a very different approach. So if you are dealing with school avoidance, kind of understanding if it's a setting piece versus kind of a mental block piece, it's very different approaches for how I would support students with a learning plan for school avoidance. And also knowing too that oftentimes you can work with school teams and school teams are willing to work with you to come up with plans. Like if you've had a child who's been school avoidant for some time and trying to get them into school is very challenging. Sometimes trying to get them to go to a full day of school is going to be hard. So sometimes working with the school team to get a half day schedule. Sometimes trying to remove some of the demand. I have worked with school teams to say, I'm going to get this kid to school and they're going to go, but you're not going to ask them to do anything more than just be sitting there and being there in school today. We're going to take any other demands away. And that comes up. I work with a lot of families who have if you're not familiar with, it's called PDA, pathological demand avoidance. It's not a diagnosis, it's kind of like a profile that can go with autism, and it very much has a very different need than what you would think of typically helping students who have an autism profile. It's a very vastly different approach. Often there's school avoidance that comes with that. So that's when I've worked with school teams to say, we're going to take away all demands other than just purely getting this child in the school. And I think it's hard because school teams go, the child's in school today, like let's learn. But sometimes it's having to take away some things and then building back up to it to get that child feeling comfortable and back and engaged in school again. All right, so creating support networks. So we talked about that a little bit. Again, I'm gonna, for time's sake, quickly kind of move through. So there are so many great community connections if you're not familiar with some of them. And I wanna say, did I put it on the next slide? I did not put it on the next slide, but I'm gonna name a couple of them. I'm gonna scroll down to my list here because there is, especially in PG County, some wonderful ones. There is the Maryland Coalition of Families. They offer support to families of children with behavioral health needs, including those who are neurodivergent. They can provide resources, support groups, advocacy assistance throughout Maryland, including PG County. There is Pathfinders for Autism. It's a Maryland-based organization dedicated to improving the lives of individuals with autism and their families. There's the ARC of Prince George's County. It offers a range of services and supports for individuals with intellectual and developmental disabilities and their families. And then don't discount Prince George's County Public Schools as well. Working with your special education team there as well is incredibly important in that kind of trio of support that we talked about at the beginning of tonight's presentation. And there is the Maryland Department of Health and Developmental Disabilities. We brought that up earlier. DDA offers services and supports for individuals with developmental disabilities. And NAMI of Maryland is the National Alliance on Mental Illness, which can provide support and education for families. So there is a lot of great resources out there. There's also so many Facebook group and social media groups now that you can get a hold of other parents who share resources, who ask questions. So if you felt alone or lost, I do recommend hopping on Facebook and just seeing what kind of supports are out there and exist, because there are a lot of families who are parents who've gone through similar things. We're very happy to kind of share their stories and work through things with other families and use some of those social media forums to do so. So I kind of gave you just a little bit of homework here, creating a list and looking at some resources if that's something that you feel like would be helpful. And then again, your engagement, making sure you're actively participating, asking questions, collaborating with educators, and then empowering self-advocacy for your child too. I really think that is a skill set that is important for your child to really learn, especially if they have a 504 or an IEP. And I'll even put, I've made these before with families as kind of a one-pager that students can put into their notebook. And they know, okay, these are my services, these are my supports, this is my time that I get. And obviously it can be more extensive based on the child, but just something that allows them to start understanding what supports and services they get. Because I often think that times students don't even know what's on their IEP. So helping them to understand can really go a long way in making sure that they're learning to self-advocate for themselves.